I'm excited to be here for two very good reasons. The first is, isn't this an amazing opportunity, a privilege to really just spend time with people who care about what we care about, this thing called ABCD. And I believe this is an incredible luxury that every one of us has got, an opportunity to share, but above all learn. And I tell you already, the conversations I've had, the people I've interacted with, the learning's on the way. It's fantastic. And the week has only just started. So I love the words of this woman. I'm doing a lot of work in the Middle East currently. She's pretty influential. The Queen of Jordan. We are stronger when we listen. We are smarter when we share. And really, this is an amazing structured opportunity for us to experience that. The second reason I'm excited to be here is this is where my roots come from. This is where my family originate from. I have a surname called Kenyon. It's a fairly rare one, but actually comes from a Normandy knight who came out with William the Conqueror in 1066, and he was given land around the Rossendale Valley here in Lancashire, and all Kenyons come out from here. So if you actually have a look at where all the Kenyons, there's a huge concentration in the Rossendale Valley, just out of Rochdale, where my family actually originate from. Important for me because I was raised by my grandparents, and this is where they came from. My grandfather, 100 years ago, a month ago, was one of those people who landed at Gallipoli. He was 15 years old. He went off for king and country. And I love it, he came back and joined the Communist Party. He was so disillusioned with war and the type of leadership and whatever. As two people, these grandparents were pretty special. And for my grandmother, the highlight of her social life was an annual holiday at this place called Blackpool. And I still can remember vividly the memories and also this great photo of kind of like being at Blackpool. And for me to get there late this afternoon is going to be one of the joys for me.
Is that you?
This is not, no, that's not me. Postcard D is 102 years old. And so it is my grandmother. And I love these people because, as I said, they raised me. They were people who were just optimists. They were people who actually were the first people I can ever remember before Jody Kretzmann talking about the half full. What have you got, Peter? You've got a choice. Look at, is it half full or is it half empty? They were amazing optimists. And they were conned, they reckon, by Australian immigration to migrate out in 1925 out to Australia, 90 years ago. And my grandfather still said he can remember he was conned by being told that the streets of Perth were paved in gold. He said he got out there and he discovered three things. The streets were not paved in gold. The streets weren't even paved. And thirdly, he ended up doing the paving as part of an unemployment project. He had a sense of humour, but you know what? They went out there and took up land and had to walk off during the Depression off their land because it was so bad. Tough life, and yet constantly they embedded in me this belief that, Peter, if you want to bring about change, it's about looking at the half full, not the half empty. So they were pretty influential in my journey into this thing called ABCD. And to come back here to where it's all began for them, to me it's quite in many ways, a spiritual journey. So I'm really excited to be back in what I see as my Mecca in lots of ways. I need to point out, us Australians are different. Now, what other country, when the Queen visits for the very first time, in this little country town, managed to get all the sheep to turn their bums to me? Only the Australians would do that. No English would ever. And I thought, that's a priceless photo. You know, getting all those sheep to kind of like turn around and just show their backside. So I really felt it. But that's us. We're often confused with both the English, who really get upset about that, and the Americans. But I need to point out we're very different. Now, I don't know how many of you know this lady called Kathy Lett. She's one of our most famous expats who lives in London. She's a very famous writer. She's also married to a fairly famous guy called Geoffrey Robinson, who many of you know is the famous human rights kind of like crusader. She recently was given a PhD at Southwark University for her work in literature. And during that speech, she pointed out the difference about how Australians and Americans respond. She said, think about it. When the first fleet arrived in America, what was the very first thing they did? they held a prayer meeting. What was the very first thing when the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay back in 1788 in Australia? It was a massive orgy, because it's the first time in 8 months that all the Irish convicts who were on separate ships actually got together, male and female. And she said, that one incident explains the difference. So Cormac, I thank you for the contribution you have made. In fact, one in 4 of us have Irish kind of like ancestry when it goes back. But really, I want to point that out because I suppose the way that the ABC journey's gone for us is often in different ways. And I don't know whether John and Jodie are horrified, but we've even changed the title. Many of us actually now refer to ABCD as asset-based, community-driven. We actually think that's more accurate. We actually are very much into a whole pile of other assets, and as you can see, the theme that I want to talk about is the most important asset that any community's got, and it's its stories, it's its heritage. And again, I've seen communities reinvent themselves simply by suddenly discovering they've got these incredible things about them that's unique about them, their heritage and their stories. This is the simple one, and we're particularly, I want to say, very much benefited from the input of a guy called Jim Deers, who isn't here, but again is one of those great people in the ABCD movement in terms of where it's at. And I suppose we are trying to interpret it and trying to demystify it in simple ways. And I suppose for us often now, I'm tending to use these very simple 4 words to capture the spirit of what this movement, what this whole process, this perspective is actually all about. And those words mean a lot to me. I want to point out that besides my grandparents, there were 6 considerable influences in my life that got me on this journey, and it's all to do with rural, kind of like Australia. The first is, and I happen to be the hairy, dark-headed one there, 40 years ago, I trained in history. I did a master's in history and got posted by our education department as a sports master to an agricultural college. Didn't quite see the relevance. I was horrified. I was trained to be a historian, and now I'm teaching sport at an ag college. But I'll never forget turning up, and on the first day the principal said, you know what, Kenyon, you've got a very simple job this year. Your job is to look after the zoo group. And I thought, oh, the school's got a farm. The school's got actually a zoo. We're going to have all these animals. No, he wasn't referring to animals. He was referring to those students who were basic in all their core subjects, and he referred to them as the zoo group. And I'll never forget his words. He said, you will be judged, Kenyon, by your ability to make sure they're never seen or heard. They are a pain, and your job is to make them invisible. I'm a naive young teacher sent out there to the bush, and that is what is my commission. I'll never forget, in naivety, gathering these 7 students around the table. And as I did from that day to this day, I love just starting off with a conversation. I just love to say to people, why don't we go around the room and share one thing about ourselves that we're proud of, that other people around this table won't know. Now, I've done that for 40 years, and every time I do it, it actually electrifies the room. People discover stuff about each other. And I'll never forget the first person who said, well, I'm proud of the fact I've knocked off 400 houses before I was caught. This guy at 15 was a professional criminal. This guy showed me how you could break a window without making a noise. A very valuable gift I have always appreciated. And so on. And as we went around, each of them had something special. And by the end, all I could say is, you know what? You guys are not the zoo group. You're a group of budding entrepreneurs. They were all little Richard Bransons, ready to be excited. And out of that conversation, I said, what are we going to do with all that stuff? And I said, sir, why don't we create a bicycle recycling shop? Why don't we start designing bicycle accessories like surfboard carrying trailers and whatever? And I tell you what, we had the greatest year of our lives together. They weren't a zoo group. They were people who weren't invisible. They were people who had amazing gifts that had never been identified, mobilised, but above all connected with each other. And I learned very early on, the critical question to ask people is, what do you bring to the table? What's your unique contribution? What do you care about? What turns you on? And as we did that, amazing things actually happened in terms of the journey. The second influence in me is I'll never forget addressing a conference on this theme of rural reinvention 20 years ago. It was in a place called Bunbury. And I'll never forget, a group of us were invited to talk about stories of what small towns have done in Australia to reinvent themselves. And boy, it was an incredible conference. And by the end of the day, we were all incredibly excited by what we had heard and shared. And we gathered like all good Aussies around the table at the end of the thing and started knocking off all these bottles of wine that a farmer had donated to us. Now, I love a good bottle of Australian red, particularly from a place called Margaret River. And we had a whole case of it. And so we sat around the table celebrating the day. And suddenly a young 17-year-old girl wanders in, sits down next to us and says, "I'm Joanne and I'm from the local newspaper and I'm here to get a story." This is the first time I've been sent out without someone following me. And I'm determined to get a good story. And I've sat here all day and listened to you, and it's a bit boring, isn't it? All you talk about is positives. We are trained as journalists, if it bleeds, it leads. And I want a negative story. And her way of doing it was to be very patient and just kept filling our glasses and filling our glasses. And over the coming 2 hours, most of us moved into a total state of drunkenness. And she just then started peppering us with questions. But they were all about, tell us what you really think. Tell us what you really think of these towns. And despite my drunk state, I held out. I held out because I believe in the positive stuff. But unfortunately, she pressed the right button. She eventually said, "What do you think of Donnybrook?" Now, I come from Bailing up, 20 k's up the road. We hate people from Donnybrook, mainly because of a grand final back in 1936 that we lost. And all I can remember is saying, "You know what, I think Donnybrook's probably the ugliest, most boring and dullest town in Australia. But don't write about that." And she said, "Why?" Well, I said, "This is the first town where gold was discovered in WA, but where do you read about that? This is a town who are famous because it's the apple town of Australia. What have they done? They've created these light shades that are just full of dead flies. That's their only way to celebrate their heritage. This is the first town in the scenic southwest, but look, all these kind of like ramshackled old shop fronts, no pride in their main street." And I went on like this. This is the town where Donnybrook stone comes from. All of our public buildings in Perth, our parliament, our university, all built with this beautiful soft stone called Donnybrook stone. It comes from this town. Not a building in Donnybrook made out of Donnybrook stone. I said, "You know what? It is the ugliest, most boring and laziest town in the country, but don't write about that." At 6 o'clock next morning, I realised she didn't follow my advice when the mayor of Donnybrook rang me. And his words were rather coarse. "You are an arsehole." His opening words. I couldn't get over it. And then he just exploded. Exploded about the damage that I'd done to the town, because there on the front page of the South West Times was me calling Donnybrook the ugliest town in Australia. And boy, was he upset, and boy, was he going to go for my end. And he promised he'd have the rugby team tar and feather me, and he really went on. And after ranting and raving for a full 12 minutes, slammed the phone down in my ear. I was reeling. Explaining to him I was drunk at the time did not help. Anyway, I spent the day in total agony. I don't mean to damage towns. I was drunk. It was an emotional reaction. But by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, things had turned around. I'd had the president of the Chamber of Commerce ring me by then, and she was totally different. "Peter, this is unbelievable. We've never seen so many tourists in town. We have suddenly found our unique like advantage. We are going to become the ugly town." And so they really started to like have a lot of fun. This guy claims to be the ugliest man in the country, living in the ugliest town, singing the ugliest birds. And the place started to boom. They then launched in a huge fundraiser. "You think I'm ugly, you should see Donnybrook." I thought I went a bit far when they started putting out a special edition and said, "If you think Donnybrook's ugly, you should see Donnybrook." This was getting a bit too personal, They decided to have fun. But she also was an opportunist, because she suddenly realised, hang on, I've actually activated this community. And she said, "You know what, Peter, you owe it to us. You're one of our assets. You need to turn up in our town this week." And I thought, no, that was the last town I was thinking of visiting. For quite a while. I'd even worked out how to get to my hometown without going through Donnybrook. But no, she said, "We promise a bodyguard for you," because the mayor was really after me. we want you here this week. We want a public meeting. We think if you turn up, you will draw an audience. Because you know what? A whole pile of people agree with you, but boy, a whole pile of people hate you. And we think that's the ingredient to get out an audience. And so 3 nights later, on a typical Donnybrook night, cold, wet, miserable, raining, I turn up and there is 400 people in the audience. And boy, it's the wildest meeting I've ever had. I had a chance to defend the comments, but you know what? She was smart, this Chamber President. She used me, really, to activate the conversation. And after about 40 minutes, she said, listen, hang on a moment, whether you agree or disagree, you know what? I reckon we are one of the most asset-rich towns, but guess what? We've never bothered to ever identify those assets. We've never bothered to kind of like promote it and build upon it. And you know what? Tonight we're going to start. And she turned that whole night around. And within that evening, they generated over 400 ideas of things that town could do. They suddenly began to recognise their heritage was apples. They hadn't run an apple festival for 8 years. They, on the spot, formed a committee and it was reactivated and so on. I remember that night someone said, you know what, we've got all these surplus apples. We've got the potential here to set up an apple cider factory. And today that place employs over 20 staff. It came out of that particular evening. That night people said, you know what, our main street doesn't need to look that bad. We are the first town. We need to recognise you don't get a second chance at first impressions. And they managed then to form a committee and spend over $2 million doing up that main street. And today it's one of the most attractive, that's the early stages. They started to do things with their beautiful heritage buildings that were just cladded with tin and started to reopen it and so on. And someone said, you know what, we had this incredible location asset. You know what we need to do is provide that excuse for people to stop. And they came up with the idea of building Australia's biggest free fun park, an amazing kids' playground that's just borders the main street. And today, it literally stops thousands of people driving through every day. An amazing story. Still a fairly ugly town in terms of what they're doing, in terms of going forward. But an amazing story. And it was a great relief 6 months down the track to read in the paper, Ugly Duckling Donnybrook fights back. And I'll never forget that story. And when you think about a community suddenly focusing on what it has got, not what it hadn't got, and what it could do with it. And the fact that even the words of a drunk can be an asset that a town can. My third influence is this guy. He's my uncle. I hadn't seen him for 20 years. He was the black sheep in our family, had gone off, and he was one of those guys who got into drugs. He was an alcoholic. He became a truck driver across Australia. By age 50, that whole lifestyle had caught up with him, and he had become a chronic diabetic. And the saddest phone call I've ever had in my life was from the Fremantle Hospital saying, you know what, that uncle you haven't seen for kind of like 20 years is lying on a bed covered in bed sores. We've just had to amputate both of his legs because of his diabetic situation. And we've had to tell him he's got less than 6 months to live. And he's asked if I could be tracked down and if I could organise to take him home back to our village where he could live out his final days with family and friends. I'll never forget that phone call. Our family, extended family, and the village responded amazing. The local hospital, small little hospital, the staff gave up one of their staff rooms so he could have his own unit. He had to be on a machine 3 times a day. The whole community rallied. He became the talk of the town. But let me say, all the talk was about his disadvantages, about his disabilities. But I'll never forget one day an orderly bounced into his room and said, you know what, Les, our town's got a challenge. We no longer have a courier service between Perth and York, and you know more about the trucking business than any other person in town. Les, you need to go into business. I couldn't believe anyone could be so dumb. Here's a dying man and you're telling him to start up a business? But that excited Les. The first time anyone had focused on his abilities, not his disabilities. By the time I'd seen him that night, he'd already had the printer in there who was printing cards for him. It simply said, you load it, you unload it, I simply deliver it. He had the local men's shed there. They were modifying his car so he could drive it without needing legs to drive. They modified the back of it so he could attach a trailer. And I'll never forget Les saying to me, you know what, Peter? I have an incredible asset as a marketing asset that no one else in this game can talk about. You know what I'm going to call my business? Legless Lizards, Curious. And he hand-painted his own signs. You know, Les didn't live for 6 months, he lived for 6 years. And I reckon that orderly should have been knighted. That orderly was the first person who really showed me that what's important is conversations around abilities, not disabilities. And the power of where that can go is phenomenal. The fourth influence in my life is a good Canadian, this guy who already referred to him as Moses Cogan, an amazing kind of like Catholic priest who had that ability during the Depression to mobilise all those maritime communities. And if you haven't read his book, I think it's one of the earliest books in ABCD, well, he never uses the word asset in the whole book. It's called Masters of Your Own Destiny. And what he basically said to poor farmers and fishing people, listen, we know you're being screwed by the corporate sector, by the government, but listen, you know, the future is in your hands. Stop focusing on what you haven't got, begin to focus on what we have got. And over a short period of time, he was instrumental in over 500 cooperatives, retail cooperatives, business cooperatives, producer cooperatives, credit societies being formed across that part of the Maritimes. One of the most impressive local economic movements you have ever seen on this planet. And he had wonderful words there that I think is one of the classic ABCD quotes. We are motivated by what we don't have to use what we do have to get what we want. I love those words, and his story has been an amazing inspiration. Number 6 is these two guys. When they came onto the scene 25 years ago, they were the ones who suddenly gave this context that many of us were working in some understanding. They demystified it. They were the ones who talked effectively about that half full and half empty. What is it? Is the glass half full or is it half empty? Well, it's not either, or it is both. But the one thing is you can't do much with the top half. It's the bottom half you can do things with. And I suppose these guys were just so instrumental in giving us an understanding and putting what many of us believed in into a context. And for that, John and Jody, I will be forever thankful. And I'm glad that this is a conference to celebrate your unique contribution. The final influence in my life has just been seeing people doing this in practice. And I suppose that's what I want to finish with. It's just a couple of stories that clearly show ABCD in action within rural and regional areas. And I suppose one of those ones is what happened in terms of the infamous, awful Canterbury earthquakes. Almost the 5th anniversary of the first earthquake. I don't know if you're aware, but there has been 11,000 earthquakes. The place continues to rock. Huge personal, human and financial loss in that particular place, centred on this beautiful city called Christchurch. My work has been with a little town out of Christchurch called Kaya Point, 20 minutes out, and it has been incredibly affected by it. Well over 60% of the buildings there became unusable and whatever. That is the horrific cost in terms of what actually happened. And I suppose when you're faced, that's what your house looks like, and that's what your church or your community centre looks like. Where do you start? And I suppose what I've learned through this is that disaster is either a time to focus on devastation, or it's also an opportunity to see utopia. And it gives us a fresh start. And I'm amazed at how many people have said to me who live in Christchurch, don't tell anyone, but you know what, in many ways the earthquake was probably the best thing that happened to us. Because you know what, we discovered community. Suddenly you got to know your neighbour. I mean, you had to share a chemical toilet with some of them for 18 months, you definitely get to know if you're sharing a chemical toilet. But you know what? People suddenly started to discover street parties and street life, and neighbours started to help your neighbour. And people then began to look at what they had with fresh eyes, began to look at how we could do things. We don't need a library to run a library service. In fact, we've got all these unused refrigerators that are ideal bookshelves. We can have this at the end of every street. What a great way to connect. And look, we don't need a hall to put on a concert. And there's a band and pianos, and it's easy. There are no rules. We can easily instigate events like this. I love this one where a guy has used a washing machine, turned it into a DJ machine, and it runs a 24-hour dance studio. I've seen romantic couples at 1 o'clock in the night waltzing on their own around here playing a romantic kind of like tune. Stuff like this started to emerge. When you don't have anything, you began to see other things. And I suppose for me, one of the great projects is this one, simply called Gap Filler. What have we got a lot of? Pallets. Everything coming into the city is on pallets. And a whole pile of volunteers built this amazing community space, all out of pallets. An amazing story of people beginning to look at what they have with fresh eyes and not seeing it as a disadvantage, but beginning to see it as an asset. The number of people in country towns who say to me, Peter, we have a row of empty shops. And I say, you haven't got empty shops, you've got unused workspaces. It's all about mindset. And it's about how do we actually activate and get people thinking that way. I love this one. You don't need a picture theatre to run films. You just need 8 guys to pedal fast. And it's much more fun in terms of where it's actually at. And one of the great stories out of Christchurch is this guy, Sam Johnson. The day of that first earthquake in September 2010, he was horrified to see on his television in the morning pictures of his city. He lived in a part that wasn't affected. He immediately was moved by emotion to want to volunteer. Get out there and help. People are really struggling. All this mud was flowing into houses and people's yards and whatever. And so he rings the local council and offers his services. And immediately his passion bubble is burst by the guy saying, hang on, we can't take everyone. We need to go through a form and check whether or not you've got what we need. And so they go through a form, and at the end of it, the guy says, thank you very much, Sam, for offering, but we think you'll just get in the way. We don't think we can use you. Sam is horrified, because this young 21-year-old is pretty skilled in something. He walks out his front door and picks up his phone and mobilises 9,000 people through text. He mobilises the student army. And while the council's still trying to work out how they're going to put in place their plan to help people with all their devastation, these 9,000 students march into the city under Sam's leadership. And look at what they achieved, 75,000 hours of work. This is a group who just fundamentally went in there, and this is the group who just with total strangers helped them to get their lives back together. And yet Sam wasn't seen to have what was needed. People have amazing gifts that we need to recognise. And my final story is about a place called South Invercargill. I want to point out where it is because New Zealanders unfortunately refer to it as the arsehole of New Zealand, right down. This is a town that not only has an unfortunate nickname, but it's a place that actually had a smell from a plant for 9 years they couldn't get rid of, a place that lost 6 of its 10 schools that were closed down, a place that had a massive drug problem, a massive housing, kind of like low-income housing problem in the sense that the company sold off all the houses and they all were then bought by investors who then trucked in people from all over the country. Their community was turned upside down. This is a community where nothing had seemed to work. And a group of leaders across 20 or local community groups came together and said, you know what, other people don't value us, but we think this is an amazing part of the world. We love our community. But we've got to stop believing that the cavalry need to come to save us. We need to recognise that reinvention is from the inside out, not from the top down or from the outside in. And we need to take responsibility. It was the message of Moses Cody. And so that particular group created what they call South Alive. And I love their mission statement, empowered by our strengths. Not by our deficiencies, our limitations, our needs, but our strengths as a community. We'll build a place to live and work that engenders pride and inspires us. And I'm finishing with this story because it's probably the most exciting story I currently know anywhere in the country or in New Zealand that's really making a difference. Those people mobilised a whole pile of people. They brought them together. They converted an old rundown church hall into the most amazing coffee shop. They invited the community to join them for a whole Sunday afternoon. They turned on the most amazing party. 180 people turned up, engaged in cafe conversation. In the course of the day, generated over 300 ideas of what their community could do for their community. At the end of it, they formed a whole pile of working groups and set up a structure all around people's passions. It wasn't about saying this is what we need to do or this is what the program's asking us to do. This is what we care about. Let's form a group, whether it's 2 of us or 20 of us, and let's start to do things with it. And so there was a group of people who said, you know what, you don't get a second chance at first impressions. And there are 4 really bad entrances into our community. They're bland and boring. But you know what? We love gardening. We could do something. And they went in there and designed them. They instigated it and they maintain it. They didn't wait for the council to come along to do it for them. Instantly, the image of the place changed. There's a group who said, you know what the biggest problem with our community is? It's all the rubbish. But we expect someone else to pick it up. We can actually do it. Let's work out a scheme. And so they came up with this thing called Zero Rubbish. 8 people who cared about that issue. And there's no greater asset in the community in discovering what people care about. And how did they solve that one? Well, they worked out that we simply get individuals and families to adopt a street. And within a month, they managed to get 135 streets adopted by either a family, an individual or a school. And simply, actually instigated instantly a makeover of that community. Using kind of like the individuals, challenging people. There are some costs involved, plastic bags that had to be removed. And they thought, who benefits from a nice cleaned up community? They're called real estate agents. And they put the heavy word and they fund it. They are the funders, the people who could benefit the best by a community looking its best. Smart use of your asset. Even the real estate agent is an asset. There's a group all they cared about. It's the fruit and nuts. They're called the Nut Group. They just run barbecues every Saturday and all the profits, they are just populating the whole community with fruit and nut trees and whatever. Amazing passion and how people are using it. And then they said, you know what? The thing that really gives any community identity is its heart. It's usually a shopping mall. It's the heart of the community. Ours would have to be the most boring in New Zealand, but it doesn't need to be like that. We can do something about it. And so again, they started by mobilising simple things and with people, clean-ups and so on. Then they decided, hang on, let's think big. And they brought in people to facilitate meetings with business and schools about what is it you want your community to look like and how could it actually happen. And suddenly from what's on the right, bland, grey and boring, they are starting to convert streetscapes into amazing places where people want to be. At the heart of that place is a shopping centre. Can you imagine a shopping centre that only had about 14 light bulbs that worked? It had about 12 broken windows. It had a sign that was all broken. There were no lines in the car park. It was just horrible. And so the group went and said, you know what? Here's a whole list of things that you, the owners of that mall, need to do to fix it up. And if you're willing to do that, there's a whole pile of things we'll do for you. So it wasn't about going and saying, we're demanding action. We're going and saying, you know what? We've got gifts here that we could bring to the table. You do all those things. And we'll provide hanging baskets, we'll provide new furniture, we'll get them sponsored, we'll clean up windows. And suddenly, within a month, that shopping centre had been reinvented. Again, it wasn't waiting for the cavalry, it was about utilising local knowledge, local passion, and starting to do things. And through that, developed relationship with the management who gave them one of the empty shops to set up their offices. Recently gave them another empty shop to create a community art gallery. And then at the back of the shopping centre was this area. And the group said, you know what, we dream of a community space, the heart of our community. Currently it looks like that. But it doesn't need to look like that. We have got the assets in our community to convert that into that. And we're asking mall management, can you give us this for 30 years for $1 a year? What a cheeky invitation. And to their surprise, they said yes. And so in came all this donated earth-moving services from the community. In came all of the working bees. And suddenly the space was kind of like reinvented pretty quickly. The very first thing they created was a half basketball court because young people there had nowhere to gather. But then they decided a whole pile of things, like a community outdoor gym that is kind of like owned now by the community. They created an amphitheatre. Their very first concert, though, they suddenly discovered they forgot something. It's called the stage. So more working bees, and next week they had their second kind of like concert on the stage. Amazing example of community, downtrodden over a half of kind of like a century, who suddenly discovered there's power in us discovering each other and what we have to offer. And today that space is just amazing. And how's it happened? It hasn't happened through some program or some service. It's happened through people's passions and contributions. And I love the way they maintain their gardens. It's about always simplifying it down to how can we use what we've got to do things to make that difference. They've introduced this amazing neighbourhood grants program based on Jim Deere's Seattle kind of like matching grant stuff. And again, the simple initiatives that people are doing in their streets and whatever. The results, absolutely amazing within less than a 3-year period. Probably though, the most powerful result is people's change in attitude. In the first year, 35% of people said they were proud to live in the community. By the end of the second year, 53%. That's a phenomenal growth. And I think the latest one now is well over 60%. Is the group making a difference? Do local people feel this movement they've instigated, based strongly upon asset-based community development principles? Well, back in 2012, 55% of locals thought the group was making a difference. At the end of 2014, 90%. Again, a phenomenal jump. I love that story. I love being involved with this group because here's a group who in their own unique way have taken those principles that John and Jody have shared and have actually used them to create the community that they wanted. They stopped waiting for the cavalry. They realised it was an inside job and they needed to engage in it. In closing, can I say that the stories that I've shared today, there are 2 quotes that actually, to me, really summarise what it's all about. The first is from this guy, Ernesto Ciroli, who said, "The future of every community lies in capturing the passion, the imagination and resources of its people." And to me, that's a pretty powerful summary of what this thing called asset-based community development or community-driven, whichever way you interpret it, is all about. And finally, in New Zealand, you're often welcomed onto a Māori marae with these words: "With your gifts, with my gifts, the people will be well." It is a classic ABCD statement. Thanks very much.